This morning, Ukraine is on offense. Russia blaming Ukraine for a drone attack that hit an oil tanker near one of its airfields. This happened overnight, and it happened in the Kursk region that is near Ukraine's northeastern border. This comes just a day after strikes on two military bases deep inside of Russia. So let's talk to U.S. Army Major, retired Army Major Mike Lyons. Good morning to you.
Good morning,
what I find interesting about your analysis of this is that you say this is Ukraine trying to send a message without explicitly claiming responsibility.
Yeah, I think it's strategic. It's got very strategic implications. The fact that they have this capability and they're showing it right now is very important, number one. And then number two, the fact that these drones got through Russian air defense platforms. That's just unheard of. We thought back during the NATO Cold War days it just wasn't possible. And lastly, psychologically, the fact that the Ukraine can take these drones, 1970s technology, strip out the cameras and strip out all that stuff, put in ordnance and put in the capability that it's hard to hit a target from 700 kilometers away. So very, very much advantage Ukraine in this.
Can you explain to us where this is happening and what
Sure.
the attacks over the weekend and then these overnight show us?
These two air bases here were the targets where strategic bombers go. Now, these are the strategic bombers not going in Ukraine because they don't control the airspace. Russia doesn't control it there. So they've been attacking this way in this direction here. But the fact is 700 or so kilometers here, 600 or so to this side here. And now Moscow is theoretically threatened. Now, these are two military targets. Let's be clear, they're legal military targets.
Yeah.
This is where they're coming from. This is where the bombers are coming from that are attacking Ukraine. But again, the bottom line is it's really hard to send a missile 700 kilometers and hit an airfield like they did.
Is this something new that Ukraine is showing that it can carry out? And if it is, do you believe this is new training from the West?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the technology that we've brought, and I think some of it is
The U.S., you're saying?
The United States, and let's call it the West. But it also likely there's somebody on the ground there painting that target. When you look at the plane damage, for example, this is a Tu-22M3 backfire bomber, old NATO. This is
this is a Russian plane?
Russian-made plane. As you can tell by this tail light here. This is the kind of damage. The fact that we can target it this closely, to me, says someone's lasing that. It was very precise. Again, it's really hard to come that distance and hit something that airfield that here. Now, going forward, Russia's got to think about military targets that are closer to the Ukraine border, like we saw this morning in Kursk. You see oil fields. Those kinds of targets now are going to be up for grabs. The Russians are going to have to reinvent their military to defend them.
Can they reinvent their military in the middle of this?
Well, they're likely going to have to redeploy forces back to protect the motherland here at this point, knowing full well that Ukraine has this capability.
Ukraine is remaining silent on Russia's accusation that it launched drone attacks inside Russian territory. Russia says a drone struck an airfield in the Kursk region early Tuesday, about 90 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. It sparked a fire at the airfield and caused the cancellation of classes in nearby schools. Russia says 3 of its soldiers were killed in an explosion Monday at a base in Engels, hundreds of kilometers inside Russian territory. That was one of 2 apparent drone attacks on Monday. My next guest is a military technology writer and author of the book Swarm Troopers, How Small Drones Will Conquer the World. Well, David Hambling joins me now via Skype from London. Good to have you with us, David.
Thanks for inviting me.
So the Russian Defense Ministry says these attacks were carried out by Ukraine. Ukraine hasn't commented. They haven't claimed responsibility. If this was indeed an attack by Ukraine within Russia using long-range drones, what does that signify in terms of Ukraine's focus on developing long-range technology and its impact?
Well, we've been here several times before in terms of there being what looked like Ukrainian drone strikes into Russian-held territory. The first one was in April when a fuel storage site got blown up. Then there have been attacks on Russian air bases and naval facilities. But what makes this one different is that this is a much longer range than before. This is something like 400 miles inside Russia, which makes it look as though Ukraine may very well have developed a long-range drone attack system.
Which is just quite incredible, right? And I understand you've been speaking to some Russian drone experts. What are they telling you about what they believe was used in these attacks?
We don't have any real evidence at this stage, but the Russians are claiming that it was a modified version of a Tu-141 Swift. The Swift is a jet-powered drone which was developed back in the Soviet era. They were manufactured in the 80s. and it was just designed to fly around at high speed at about 600 miles an hour, take photographs and come back. And what they're saying is the Ukrainians have just stuck an explosive warhead on it and sent it on a one-way mission. Now, that's quite plausible because we've seen a couple of other Swifts come down with warheads like that, though we don't actually know whether the Ukrainians or the Russians have been launching them because both sides have them. It may be something rather more sophisticated, though. It may actually be a locally built drone. Now, that would be a lot more significant because it would mean that Ukrainians could potentially build them and launch them in large numbers, much in the same way as the Russians are launching Shahed 136 drones at Ukraine. And that's what's doing a lot of damage to the power grid at the moment.
Right. And so, you know, Russia initially had set out to take Ukraine quite quickly, talking up the capabilities of its own defense forces in comparison to Ukraine. Why then can't Russia stop these types of attacks within its own borders?
Well, there is a meme out there which goes, "What air defense doing?" Which was what one of the Russian commentators asked after the first one of these drone attacks. The Russian air defense seems to be amazingly inept. It's interesting that the Ukrainians, who have exactly the same hardware, they're using the same missiles and same radar, are being very effective at shooting down Russian aircraft. The Russians, for whatever reason, we suspect it may be to do with training, it may be to do with command and control, and it may be because they have a problem with friendly fire, simply aren't performing to the same level. And time after time, we've seen drone attacks go clean through what are supposed to be one of the toughest integrated air defense systems in the world, and it's just not performing at the moment. And I'm sure the Russians are asking themselves very much that question.
Yeah. So big picture for us, David. If these are indeed drones being built in Ukraine to attack Russia, how big of an escalation is this, and how could it potentially shift the way this war goes?
Well, it's interesting the choice of target, if that's what it was. Engels Air Base is home to Russia's strategic long-range bombers. Those are aircraft that are being used to lob cruise missiles at Ukraine from long range. At the very least, they're going to have to be very much more careful about leaving them out on the tarmac in places where they can be seen by satellites and are an easy target. Worst case, the Russians are going to have to move those back out of range. Many hundreds of kilometers further away, which is going to make life more difficult for them. Realistically, though, there are a lot of other targets. There are ammunition dumps, there are fuel dumps, there are air defense sites, there are logistics hubs. Ukraine's going to cause Russia all sorts of problems if they can just hit those things with small drones. And even if these don't carry a big warhead, it's the technique known as bring the detonator. If your target is a pile of explosives or a pile of fuel, or even something like gas storage or an oil refinery, it doesn't need a big warhead. It just needs good targeting, and you can set the whole lot off. That's going to cause the Russians a lot of big headaches.
Yeah, exactly. An interesting turn here. We did see, of course, the Russian President Putin meeting with Kiev's Security Council to discuss this. So major concerns within Russia. David Hambling, good to get your perspective and expertise. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.